Hi everybody, this is John, and this is part 4 of the white linen tutorial. In this tutorial we are going to finish up, and we're going to go through the shading, the lighting, depth of field, rendering, and compositing. So lots of stuff. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, but just leave comments if you have any questions, if something's not clear or something like that. So let's go ahead and jump on into Blender, and let's look at the materials. So in the last tutorial we looked at setting up the scene and getting everything looking all right as far as the composition, and now we are ready to shade this, to light it, and to render it. So the shader setup actually is pretty easy on most of the pieces in this scene. So let me just walk through each of these shaders one by one, and you can see how they're set up. So first I'm selecting this sheet here in the front row, and this guy has a shader that's fairly simple. Let's look through it here. So the first thing we have, one of the things that's really important, or was really important when I was setting up these materials, was I wanted to make sure the cloth was translucent. So I made sure that I had a translucent shader in here, this translucent BSDF, and you can create your shaders from the Add menu under Shader, and you can add all the different shader types right in here if you're unfamiliar with that. There's a diffuse component as well to this shader, and I'm mixing the translucent and the diffuse, okay, and I'm mixing that by a factor of 0.3. So what this means is that if I go to 1, it's all diffuse. If I go all the way to 0, it's all the way translucent. So 0.3, around there, I think I had it around there, is mostly translucent, but there's still some diffuse shading in there as well. So one other important thing about this diffuse component is that there is actually an image texture coming into it, and I'll show you what that image texture looks like. So the image texture is this one right here, this crumpled paper, and this is what's giving that kind of crumpled fabric look when you look at the final image here. So all of these folds that are here in the cloth is coming from that texture. And there's actually a name for this in cloth. It's called hysteresis, and it's basically the property of cloth that allows folds and things that have happened in the cloth to stay in the cloth. It's like the cloth's memory, if you will. So if you fold a cloth and it stays folded for a long time, it tends to develop a wrinkle that stays unless you apply heat or you apply something else to pull that fold out. And so this hysteresis is being added into the cloth through this texture, and I'll put a link to this texture in the description of the video on the website. It came from cgtextures.com, I believe. So I'm bringing that image texture in, and I'm using this screen node here, which actually you can find in the, I believe it's a color. No, this is, okay, yeah, this is in here. You know, it's a mix node. That's what it is. So here's all the different blend types in the mix node, and you see I've put my texture into the top, and I've just put a kind of grayish color right here. And what this is doing is it's basically modulating my my image texture here. So if I have this all the way down, the image texture is going to show up pretty dark, like all of the darks are going to show up in my final shader. And so what I'm doing with this screen is I'm basically saying wash those out. so that I pretty much flatten out most of the really harsh wrinkles. So I'm using this kind of to take away the contrast. There's other ways you could do that, but I'm using this screen node here to take away the contrast before I feed it into the diffuse shader. And then that image texture, of course, is going through a mapping. I don't think this is even being used. No, it's not. So you don't even need this mapping node, but I'm using UV texture coordinates for this sheet, which is important. So if I select my sheet here and we look at this, in here you can see that I have my UVs laid out. And if you've done this in Marvelous Designer, which is where we did it for this tutorial, your UVs will be nearly perfect. They will be laid out in a 0 to 1 space. And so your texture should map pretty much perfectly. But it's important that you use those UV coordinates, so you can just plug those right in here to the vector. We don't need this mapping node. We're not actually using that. So that is where the shading is coming from, and we're mixing in a tiny bit of a glossy component. This is giving a little bit of specularity, and you can see I'm barely bringing in that specularity. I've turned up the roughness really high, and I'm barely using this contribution. You can see what happens if I turn it up. I get a lot of specularity, so it gets really shiny, but we don't want this sheet to be really shiny. We want almost nothing as far as the specularity, and we want what specularity there is to be distributed across the surface. We don't want it to be a harsh highlight like this right here. So I've turned the roughness way up to distribute the highlight over the surface, and then I've basically turned the specular component almost completely off. And then that goes into our surface there. So that is the basic shading. And then we have a little bit of a displacement component in here, and this is just a normal map actually. So let's get rid of this mix node we don't need. So once again, we're using our UV coordinates. Mapping, it looks like we're not even using this node either, so that doesn't even need to go there. I often put a mapping node there if I think I need to move a texture around in UV space, but in this case I didn't end up actually using it. And then I'm using a normal map here, and the normal map that I'm using, I'll show you what it looks like. It's basically just my crumpled sheet texture, and I've created a normal map with this, and I use the program bitmap to material is the program that I use to create normal maps. There are a lot of other ways you can create a normal map, and I'll put some links to different softwares that you can use to create a normal map in the tutorial description. So I'm taking that normal map, I'm using the normal map node. That is very important. You want to make sure that you use the normal map node. It's right here in the vector section. And I plug in the color from the normal map, and I make sure I use my UV map to do the mapping, and then I can set the strength. And in this case I've set the strength to 0.01. Basically I barely want any contribution from the normal map. So I want just a tiny bit of contribution, and then I plug that into the displacement. And so that's the completed sheet shader for this front sheet. The other shaders for the clothing are mostly the same, actually. So if we look at the remainder of these, I'll really quickly show you what they look like. It's the exact same shader setup at the top, and we're using a normal map as well on the bottom. It's the exact same thing. The only difference is I'm not actually using the crumpled sheet texture, this one right here. I'm not using this on the other clothing. So the shader is completely the same except for that. The only shader that is different, other than all of these are using the exact same shader, every single one of them is the same. The only difference is this tank top right here. And the reason this tank top is using something slightly different is I wanted to really pump up the translucency on this tank top. And so the mix factor for this is slightly different on the tank top. So there's values that are a little bit different. They're not very different, but they're just a little bit different. So that's something that you can play around with if you want to play around with the different translucency settings on the various shirts and different things that you're hanging from the clothesline. That's how you do it. So the next shader we're going to look at this rope really quickly. The rope shader is very simple. There's actually two shaders on here. It's important to mention. So the rope itself is just using a diffuse shader, and then I am mixing in white, and I'm using a wave texture here. So what this wave texture is doing is it's basically putting bands on my clothesline here. So what happens when we render this is we get this banding. Let me turn this render on here so you can see it. Oh, let's turn on our border so we don't render what's outside of the viewport here. And let's zoom in on this clothesline. So you can see what's happening here. I'm getting this banding on the clothesline, and that's coming from this wave texture. And here are the parameters that I've set on the wave texture. So I'm using bands instead of rings. I'm using the UV coordinates. This is UV unwrapped, and here's the various parameters that I'm using for that wave texture. And then I basically use the mix node to come in and to basically desaturate it, take a lot of the color out. So you can see what happens if I pump this down. I get black lines. I obviously don't want that, and so this is basically softening those black lines so that they're just very light gray, and that's what that mix is doing. So the other thing that I'm doing here is I'm using this wave texture also to displace the rope. So I take the color coming out of here and I put it into this mix, and this is controlling my displacement. So you notice if I pump this up, I actually get more of a bump map, and if I take it down, I get less of a bump map. So I'm using that mix node to control how much bump I actually put on the rope, and that's how that's happening. So that is the rope shader. The clothespin shader is actually very simple as well. Let's look at it really quick. So here it is. So I'm actually using generated UV coordinates. I'm not even caring about the UV coordinates of the clothespin itself. And I messed around with these a little bit. I rotated them and I scaled them a bit in this mapping node, and then I've used a wood texture, which you can see here. Let me bring it up. Wood rough. And this is also coming from cgtextures.com. I'll put a link to it in the video description. And I am then using that image texture and I'm pumping it in right here to a mix where I basically mod its color. So I use this to change the overall color of the clothespin, and I'm just mixing it 50-50 with the color from the texture and the color that I've specified here. So you can see if I go 0, I've got pure color from here. If I go all the way the other way, this is what the texture color is. So 50-50 gives me a nice balance between the two. And then I'm pumping that color into my diffuse shader, and that goes into my surface. And then I'm also taking the image texture and I'm using that for a slight bump map. The spring on the clip actually is not complicated at all. I mean, this is what it is. It's basically just a diffuse and a glossy shader, and they're mixed together, and so that's what it looks like right there. So that is my spring portion of the clothespin. And that's the clothespin shader, so nothing too fancy there. The other shaders that we have here in the scene, one that's important to note, we have a ground plane in here, and this ground plane is important because it's actually going to provide a little bit of bounce light. So just put a ground plane in there and give it a green diffuse shader. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us a little bit of bounce light when we render this, so that we have a little bit of green coming up from the ground. And it's very subtle, but you would notice if it wasn't there. So there's my green grass, you can see, and it's getting a little bit of bounce coming up into the clothing there. So there's that shader. The other shader to mention, so let's see, we've gone through the sheets, we've gone through the ropes, we've gone through the clothespins. The butterfly I'm mentioning in a separate tutorial. The only other shaders we need to look at is there is a shader on this fuzz on the rope here. So I'm not going to go over the parameters for this fuzz on the rope. It's actually not very complicated. Just come in here, make a particle system, set it to hair, and then you just basically play around with the parameters until you get something that kind of is looking the way you want it to look. If someone's really interested, I can go into the details of how to do the fur. I actually go into some details about fur in the butterfly tutorial. So if you're really interested in learning how to add this fuzz to the ropes, watch the butterfly tutorial, because the butterfly has fuzz on it as well, and I go into detail about how to generate that fuzz. So there is a special shader on the fuzz though, which is important to note. So I've added this rope fuzz shader, and you can add multiple materials per object in Blender. If you just click this plus button, it adds a new material slot. And so you can see here that when we look at the rope fuzz shader, what it's doing is it's using a translucent shader and a transparent shader, and it's mixing them 50-50. So what we get is we get this very kind of glowy, translucent, semi-transparent looking shader. And what this does is it basically makes this fuzz appear just barely. And that's what we want. Is we want the fuzz to look extremely fine. We want it to look like it's barely there, but it adds a lot of kind of subtle detail to the image, so it really helps to have it. So you can see what adding that does, and once we put this against a background, we'll actually get a little bit of background color passing through these hairs, which will make them have this kind of semi-transparent feel. So that is the rope fuzz shader. And I've actually created the exact same shader on this sheet as well. And I actually did this, I think I have it probably in a different layer, but let me show you what it looks like on the final image. So I added fuzz to this front sheet as well, and you can see it here along the edge of my image. There's just a little bit of fuzz, and it's a small detail. It's actually all over this front sheet. You can see just little tiny blips of white, and this is all the little fuzz that's on this front sheet. So I added those little bits of fuzz, and they have that exact same rope shader. Adds just a tiny bit more detail, tiny bit more realism. So that's something that you might want to add as well, and it's using the same shader. So those are all of our shaders. Let's go ahead and let's move to the next section, which is rendering and lighting. So the lighting in this scene is actually very simple. All I have is I have this sphere up here, and I've given it a strength of 1372, and this is basically my sun in the scene. And you can see where it's positioned. It's positioned pretty high up above in the scene. If I look at this scene from from the top, you can see how it's positioned here. And this is providing sunlight so that the sun kind of is shining through my clothing. And basically I just arrived at that position through trial and error. I turned on my rendered viewport here, and I just moved that sun around until I had it kind of where I wanted it. So you see I can select it here, and if I hit the G key I can move it around, and then I can wait a minute and see how the image resolves and see what the lighting looks like. So that's pretty much all I did. The other lighting component that is in this scene, which you can't actually see here, is I've added some image-based lighting. And so to do that, you need to go here to your world settings, and if you click on your color, choose environment texture. And once you get your environment texture, you can add in here a texture. And I've gone ahead and I've grabbed an image-based lighting texture from hdrlabs.com. They have a whole bunch of really great image-based lighting HDR images here that you can download and use. These are all under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike license. And they work really great. The one I used for this tutorial is this basketball court. So I downloaded that and I plugged it right in here. And what that's doing is it's providing a bunch of ambient light in my scene, and you can actually see it if we come in here to our render settings under film. If I turn off transparent, there you can see the image, and you can see what it looks like if I turn off that contribution here. Here's the strength of the contribution. I have it up to 6. If I turn it to 0, you'll notice the difference. So that light is contributing a lot to the scene, that image-based light. So that's really important to add in. And I've used this rotation value here to basically scrub and rotate it around until I liked the lighting scenario that it was giving me. So you can just rotate this around until you like the way the shadows are looking and you like the way the lighting is falling. And it's best to do this obviously looking through your camera view, so that when you are looking at this, you're getting an accurate representation of what the final lighting is going to look like. So that is the lighting. Very simple. The next thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at the rendering. So I'm going to turn off our preview render here. It's slowing down because it's calculating. Alright, turn off. There we go. So in our rendering settings, there's a couple things you're going to want to set. So I'm using my GPU to render this. I have it set to 1920 by 1080, and I'm actually rendering it at twice that size, so I'm rendering it at 200%. The frame range doesn't really matter because we're not actually using the frame range, and I just dumped these out to my desktop as PNG images. It's important though that you render them out with an alpha channel. That's really important because for this particular image, I created this image for a parallax header on my website, and I wanted to be able to see movement between those layers. So I rendered them out as separate layers, and I needed the transparency. So that's important to make sure you have that checked on. And then here in your samples, I've turned my samples up to 1,000, and that actually was enough. 1,000 was enough to reduce the noise and give me a nice looking image. The only other thing that we want to look at before going forward is, I mentioned this in a previous tutorial, that I set up depth of field, and that's really important in this scene because we want the foreground to be in focus and we want the background to be out of focus. So we're going to have something that looks like this. So the foreground's in focus, the background's out of focus, and each layer gets progressively more out of focus. So the way I've set this up, is in the camera settings, I've turned on the limits so that I can see where my focus plane is. And then I've taken this empty here, which is basically just a space locator, and I've plugged that in to my focus right here in the depth of field. So when I move this empty in the scene, you'll notice that my focal plane changes. So I used that to set my point of focus on the front clothesline, so that this area is what would be in focus. And you'll notice that my area that's in focus is actually not necessarily the butterfly, it's about the middle of the clothesline. So the butterfly is even slightly blurred. But then the important things setting up this depth of field, you want to make sure that you set the f-stop or the aperture, and I've set it to something extremely low so that I have a very shallow depth of field. So let's go ahead and let me do this really quick. I'm going to draw a render region over my render window here, and I'll turn on the rendering so you can see what the depth of field is doing. So if you don't know about photography, the f-stop is basically it's basically the size of the hole that's letting light into your camera lens. And so the smaller the f-stop, the bigger the hole. It's kind of counterintuitive, but the larger number you have for an f-stop, the smaller the hole. So f.2 in this case is a very big, wide open camera lens. It's a wide open aperture. And so let me show you what this does if I set this to something like f22. So notice all of a sudden that my background, and this is going to be a little hard to see because it would have to resolve sufficiently for you to notice that well. Actually, let me turn off I'm going to turn transparent on so we don't render the background here. And if you see f22, this background is actually pretty much in focus. These are all pretty in focus. If I turn this back to 0.2, notice what happens. So notice how blurry the background gets. It's because I have a shallow depth of field now. So that's probably the single most important number that you're going to adjust in your depth of field is this f-stop. And that's what's going to give you this nice shallow depth of field. So once you've set that all up and you're ready to render, the only thing you really need to know, I think actually we've set up the samples, we've set up the image, that's it actually. So all you have to do now, the way I did this was I separated each of my different planes that I wanted on separate render layers. So here's my front layer. Oh, not including that. I think my butterfly's on the fourth layer here. So I clicked on my fourth layer and my first layer, and then I hit my render button. So I'd hit render right here, and it would go and render that. And then after that render was finished, I turned on my second layer, and I rendered that. And then after that was finished, I turned on my last layer, and I rendered that. And it was basically that simple. I rendered out each of those layers. I'll show you what they look like individually. So here's my front layer, there's the next layer, and then there is the background layer. And for my very background, I actually used a photo that I had taken. This is a photo from my backyard. My daughter's actually in the scene here on the bottom left corner. And I just took this into Photoshop and I applied a blur to it. And it blurred it out, and I tried to match my depth of field with the blurred background. And so there is my blurred background. And then I took all of those images into Photoshop and I stacked them one on top of another. And I literally did nothing more than that. I just stacked them on top of each other, and there it was, the final image, all complete. And so that is it. That is part 4 of the white linen tutorial. For those that are interested and want to learn about how I made the butterfly, I've outlined that in a different set of tutorials, which will be soon coming. But I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial series, and I hope it's been informative. If you have any questions, go ahead and let me know. I'm happy to answer them if I can. I hope you've enjoyed this.